We often think of the U.S. Constitution as the starting point for America, but it really wasn't. It was actually the country's first big reboot. Today, we're going to get into the story of America's first government, the one that failed, and the incredible, messy process of creating the one we live under today.
So, just imagine for a second, you've just won a war against a powerful king. Your number one fear is creating another government that's too powerful, right? But what happens when you go too far in the other direction? What happens when your government is so weak it just can't function? Well, that was the exact crisis facing the brand new United States. Their first shot at a government was called the Articles of Confederation, and that phrase right there says it all: a league of friendship. The idea wasn't to create one unified nation, but more like 13 independent countries in a friendly alliance. I mean, they were terrified of recreating the kind of tyranny they had just fought a war to escape. And that choice, that deliberate decision to make it weak, is where all the problems started. The founders built a government designed not to get in the way, but they pretty quickly found out that it couldn't really get anything done either. And when you look at the details, it's actually kind of shocking. Think about this. No president to actually enforce the laws, no Supreme Court to interpret them, the central government couldn't even tax people. It literally had to go to the states and ask for money, like an allowance. And surprise, surprise, the states rarely paid up. To pass any important law, you needed 9 of the 13 states to agree, which was nearly impossible. And maybe the scariest part, it couldn't raise a national army. The country's basically defenseless. It was a government that was, by its very design, set up to fail.
For a few years, these were just frustrating problems on paper. But then, a crisis exploded that showed everybody just how dangerous a weak government could really be.
In 1786, you have these farmers in Massachusetts. Many of them were actually veterans of the Revolutionary War, and they were losing their farms because of insane state taxes and debt. So, led by a guy named Daniel Shays, they grabbed their weapons and marched on the state capitol. They were basically doing the exact same thing they had done against the British just a few years before. Now, some people, like Thomas Jefferson, who was all the way over in Paris, had this very philosophical take on it. He saw these little rebellions as, a healthy part of liberty. He basically said, hey, a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. But back in America, nobody was feeling philosophical. They were terrified. The national government, with no money and no army, could do absolutely nothing to help Massachusetts put down the rebellion. It was this horrifying wake-up call that this League of Friendship was about to collapse into total chaos. That panic from Shays' rebellion was the final push. It was suddenly crystal clear to everyone that the Articles had to be fixed or the entire country was going to fall apart. So a meeting was called in Philadelphia to try and solve the crisis. So 55 delegates show up. And the official goal was just to tweak the Articles, fix the problems. But very quickly, behind closed doors, they made this incredibly radical and totally secret decision. The Articles were a lost cause. They decided to just throw the whole thing out and start over from scratch. So, the first and biggest fight they had was all about power. Specifically, how would states be represented in this new government? Would big states with lots of people get more of a say, or would every single state be equal? And this slide really shows the two sides. The big states, like Virginia, pushed a plan where representation was based on population. More people, more power. Makes sense, right? But the small states, like New Jersey, were terrified of being pushed around, so they demanded equal representation for every state, no matter the size. And on this issue, the convention was completely stuck. The whole thing almost fell apart right there. But the solution they came up with, known as the Great Compromise, was actually pretty brilliant. They created a two-house legislature. In the Senate, the small states got what they wanted. Every state gets 2 senators, equal power. But in the House of Representatives, the large states won. Representation is based on population. It was this genius move that gave both sides a win.
But as soon as they solved that problem, a much darker and more divisive issue came right to the surface. If representation in the House is based on population, how do you count enslaved people? Southern states, of course, wanted to count them to get more power in Congress. Northern states argued that since slaves were treated as property and couldn't vote, they shouldn't be counted for representation at all.
And let's be really clear here. This was not a debate about humanity. This was a cold, hard negotiation about political power. The result was the infamous 3/5 compromise.
For every 5 enslaved people in a state, 3 would be counted toward its population for representation in Congress. And the terrible compromises over slavery didn't stop there. The northern states wanted Congress to have the power to ban the international slave trade immediately. The southern states threatened to walk out of the convention entirely. The deal they eventually struck was basically to kick the can down the road. Congress would be forbidden from banning the slave trade for at least another 20 years.
So after months of these intense, difficult compromises, a new constitution was finally written. But the work was far from over. Now they had to actually sell it to the American people, and a massive debate just erupted across the country.
You basically had 2 teams with 2 totally different visions for America. The Federalists, led by guys like Alexander Hamilton, they were all for the new Constitution. They wanted a strong, stable national government. But on the other side, you had the Anti-Federalists. They looked at the new powers, the power to tax, to raise an army, and they saw the ghost of King George. They were terrified this new government would crush people's rights, and they had one non-negotiable demand: a Bill of Rights.
To try and win this debate, the Federalists basically launched a massive PR campaign. They wrote a series of 85 essays, the Federalist Papers, that were published in newspapers all over the country. They were making a direct appeal to the people, explaining exactly how the new government would work, and arguing that it was a protector of liberty, not a threat to it. But in the end, the essays weren't enough. To get this thing over the finish line, the Federalists had to make one last massive concession. They promised that if the states agreed to ratify the Constitution, the very first thing the new government would do is add a Bill of Rights. And that promise is what sealed the deal, because the Bill of Rights was a direct answer to all the biggest fears the Anti-Federalists had. Worried the government would control what you say or believe? The First Amendment has you covered. Worried it would just invent new powers for itself? The 10th Amendment says any powers not given to the federal government belong to the states or the people. Each amendment was a specific solution to a specific fear.
The magic number was 9. 9 of the 13 states had to vote yes. After months of really bitter debates all over the country, New Hampshire cast that deciding vote in 1788. And just like that, the Constitution was the new law of the land, even though some states, like Rhode Island, held out for another couple of years.
So when you look back, it's so clear. The Constitution wasn't some perfect document handed down from the heavens. It was hammered out in a hot, sweaty room through fierce arguments, practical deals, and some really painful compromises between people who had completely different visions for what this new nation should be.
And that leaves us with this final thought. This document is a bundle of deals made over 2 centuries ago. The Great Compromise, for example, is the reason why today, California, with nearly 40 million people, has the exact same number of senators as Wyoming, with less than 600,000. The compromises over slavery echoed for a century, and the fight over the Bill of Rights is still at the heart of our most passionate debates. So which of these foundational bargains do you think still shapes our world the most today?